So committee will come to order, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for being here. Today's hearing will analyze China's activity and engagement in sub-Saharan Africa. In particular, we will look into what motivates China and how Chinese involvement has affected African countries. While a number of African nations have welcomed Chinese engagement and investment, it often comes at a very high cost. A focus on extractive industries, entanglement with neo-mercantilist trade policy, and a tendency to adopt worst practices that prop up kleptocrats and autocrats, such as DR Congo's Joseph Kabila, while fueling corruption in an effort to win contracts. China's engagement in Africa was once driven by revolutionary ideology, motivated by competition with the Soviet Union, as much as it was directed at capitalist rotors aligned with the United States. In Angola, for example, in 1975, Soviet-backed communists bested Chinese-backed revolutionary rivals, including Jonas Savimbi, who was a Maoist before he was reborn in the 1980s as an anti-communist freedom fighter. Today, China's one-time Marxist-Leninist Maoist impulse has been softened to the point of almost, but not quite, disappearing, with revolution replaced by infrastructure projects, trade missions, soft loans, and scholarships for promising African students, all part of a ubiquitous Beijing effort at hegemony. While on the one hand, Africa needs investment and it needs infrastructure, we see worrisome trend of African countries sliding into indebtedness to China, accumulating burdens that may be beyond their capacity to meet. All too often, the roads China builds are meant to allow it access to mineral resources that it can extract and ship to China, or are a part of a One Belt, One Road initiative which is designed to benefit China and ultimately help its project power. Further, as anyone who has been to Africa has observed, these grand construction projects often utilize Chinese engineers and workers and not Africans. And I remember being in the capital of DR Congo on one of many trips to Africa and seeing a large number of Chinese workers. They didn't look very happy. I thought they probably were Laogai prisoners who were there working, and they didn't even look up during the about an hour of observation by myself and a member of our embassy staff. As we will hear today, nowhere in Africa is the problem of indebtedness more pronounced than in Djibouti, a strategically important country in the Horn of Africa, which sits astride the Mandeb Strait, and one of only 5 African countries where Secretary of State Tillerson is visiting on his trip to Africa this week. A former French colony, Djibouti hosts a French military base and an American one, and just last summer, Djibouti also hosts, as of last summer, China's only permanent military base outside of China. China's overall foreign aid and financial leverage on the continent has been difficult to quantify, and as has demonstrating how that translates into influence. Yeoman work in this regard has been done by Aid Data at the College of William & Mary, which in written testimony, which is being submitted as part of the record without objection, demonstrates a correlation with how African country votes at the United Nations General Assembly and how much aid it receives from China. There is a quid pro quo. Another strategically important country with high indebtedness to China that the Secretary will visit is Ethiopia. It is also a country where China has most clearly aligned itself with repressive forces. In addition to assisting the government in controlling information flows, such as jamming the Voice of America and BBC broadcasts, the Chinese Communist Party has engaged in Ethiopia's ruling party with, quote, training and exchanges. And just recently we held yet another hearing on this brutality by the Ethiopians in this subcommittee. At the Brookings Institution, as it has documented, cadres from the ruling Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front were, quote, taught comprehensively how to manage their own organizational structure, ideological work propaganda system, and cadre education. Thus, it seems ideology still matters with regard to how China engages with Africa. It is no coincidence that Ethiopia has become one of the most repressive regimes on the continent and the subject of a House resolution focused on Ethiopia's abusive practices that Ms. Bass and I have sponsored, HRES 128. Whereas the U.S. emphasizes good governance, it suits China's interest to train its partners in old-style Leninism. We have also received testimony from one of our witnesses on how China projects power in the form of Confucius Institutes located in close to 40 African nations. And I would point out, parenthetically, that as co-chairman of the China Commission, I've had hearings and requested a GO report on Confucius Institutes in this country. There are well over 100. They have a disproportionate impact. Their teachers carry with them the ideology of Beijing, and to the receiving universities and colleges, they're often seen as just another addition, free money, if you will, but with a very, very significant cost, because it is a projection of soft power. This subcommittee has held hearings on how China has used these to push the Sino-centric narrative, again, which aligns with Communist Party propaganda and totally curtails academic freedom. In addition to utilizing Confucius Institutes to train Mandarin speakers and indoctrinate students with a pro-China worldview, China is expanding its media presence in Africa. Kenya is the country with the largest penetration of Chinese media and the highest level of brand recognition, according to our Broadcasting Board of Governors, which oversees the Voice of America, and which recently conducted a survey of China's media presence in Africa. It should be noted that of the 5 major international networks in Kenya, China's news broadcasts were the least, I say again, least trusted. Here is also a thought for Voice of America and the Broadcasting Board of Governors to consider: add Mandarin programming to the repertoire of languages in which you broadcast in Africa. By broadcasting objective news stories in Mandarin, you will expose not only African students learning Mandarin to more truthful media, but you will be able to reach the estimated 1 million or so Chinese living or working in Africa with news that they are otherwise unable to access. China is also Kenya's largest bilateral lender and one of the 3 highest debtor nations in Africa, along with Djibouti and Ethiopia. It is also a country where Secretary Tillerson will be visiting. On his trip, he may want to highlight the following anecdote, which I believe aptly contrasts China's African engagement with that of the United States. Health commodities supplied by the U.S. Agency for International Development, including life-saving antiretrovirals distributed as part of our PEPFAR program, and anti-malarial commodities, used to be shipped to and stored in a warehouse near Nairobi for distribution not only throughout Kenya, but also neighboring East African countries as well. Then in July 2013, Kenya's parliament proposed a 1.5% levy on all imports to Kenya to help pay for the nearly $4 billion railroad from the port of Mombasa to Nairobi, built by the state-owned China Road and Bridge Corporation. Donated goods, including antiretrovirals for Kenyans living and coping with HIV/AIDS, were subject to this levy to help pay Kenya's debt to China. As a result of this, the flow of life-saving commodities into Kenya and neighboring countries was burdened and slowed. Kenya's Ministry of Health offered to step in and pay the levy, but their payments were often delayed by some 2 months. Meanwhile, charges attributable to clearance delays continued to accrue and had to be paid by the United States taxpayer. Ultimately, over a year later, Kenya's parliament amended the legislation to exclude donated goods from the Chinese railway payment levy, but the damage had been done. Today, due to this experience and other factors related to logistics and a new USAID implementation partner, USAID no longer uses a warehouse in Kenya. Storage and distribution has been moved offshore to a location less centrally located, but one hopes less prone to disruption. I close with a number of questions. How did this warehouse episode born out of Kenya need to repay debt to China benefit Kenyans suffering from HIV/AIDS? How did it affect the ability of Kenya to serve as a regional distribution hub for East Africa, with all the collateral economic benefits that accrue from this purely humanitarian initiative paid for by the United States taxpayers? More broadly, where is China's PEPFAR, or the equivalent of the President's malaria initiative? These are questions and more that we on the subcommittee will have for this very, very distinguished group of panelists. But before going, I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, the ranking member, Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, you are calling an important hearing to examine China's economic and political impact in Africa. The title of this hearing raises the question as to whether or not China should be viewed as the new colonial power within the continent of Africa. I'm very much concerned about that as well, especially with regard to labor, given the need for employment on the continent and the recurring disputes about wages and the treatment of workers. There are also concerns about the extractive nature of China's engagement and what is now being referred to as debt trap diplomacy. This concept poses the question of whether developing countries are mortgaging their resources and strategic assets to China. If there is a drop in commodity prices and countries have difficulties with these loans, they might get caught in a debt trap that leaves them vulnerable to China's influence. These are critical issues and that I will expect to be addressed throughout the hearing. A recent Atlantic Council report entitled Escaping China's Shadow, Finding America's Competitive Edge in Africa, argued that the presence of Chinese companies does not preclude American business success. So I hope that our discussion today will shed light on the fact that U.S. companies can and should be doing business in Africa. Some people suggest that China shouldn't be in Africa, but instead of going down that road, I would rather say that the U.S. should step up our involvement. If we are concerned about the Chinese, then where are we? There's a major infrastructure deficit across the African continent. African countries need roads, hospitals, school buildings, and other vital infrastructure, and China is currently filling that need. But the United States can too. But we should do so in a responsible fashion that benefits African countries and U.S. businesses, and African nations want to partner with U.S. businesses. In fact, the President of Ghana was just in the United States, and one of his goals in coming here was to encourage investment and partnership in order to develop a relationship with the United States that is characterized by increased trade and investment cooperation. We should remember that as we seek to promote U.S. trade and direct investment in Africa, we are also creating opportunities for African growth so that the African middle class can help create societies that are no longer dependent on foreign aid. The chairman and I, as well as the full committee chairman, Chairman Royce, have worked on a number of initiatives that really begin to reframe how we do foreign aid, such as Feed the Future, Mr. Chairman, and Electrify Africa, where we're promoting our business involvement with the goal of African nations not being dependent on foreign aid. I also hope that our discussion today will highlight areas of common interest between the United States and China in Africa that could provide the basis for enhanced bilateral and multilateral cooperation, particularly on important conflict mediation priorities across the continent. So my goal for this hearing, therefore, is to be forward-thinking in how we view China's engagement across Africa. We must continue to stay focused on U.S. policy toward Africa by partnering with African nations and deepening our engagement with African civil society, especially the next generation of leaders, because rest assured, if the United States loses focus, other countries are more than happy to fill any gap left behind by the U.S. So I look forward to this hearing, look forward to our distinguished witnesses on how the U.S. can help achieve these objectives. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me now go to Ambassador Rooney. Any opening comments?
I'm not on the committee, but I'd like to thank Chairman Smith for letting me come and learn a little bit more about Africa. I've been in 100 countries, and Africa is the one part of the world I'd freely admit I know the least of. So I've been reading your material and look forward to your testimony. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'd like to now yield to Dr. Barra.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member, not just for the hearing, but also for your leadership in making sure Congress stays interested in the continent of Africa. Yeah, I absolutely look forward to the witness testimony as well as getting more information. And when we were with Ambassador Green yesterday and just thinking about where USAID is going, and given his history in Africa as well, I know our aid and development work really is looking at capacity building and helping look at the unique resources in the countries that we're going into and trying to move towards capacity building. And I'd be really interested in hearing from the witnesses, because when I think about China's involvement, and we welcome that foreign direct investment into Africa and other developing countries, our worry though is China is, with that foreign direct investment, it's Chinese companies that are building a lot of that infrastructure. It's Chinese workers that are benefiting from that, as opposed to looking at the workforce in the countries that they're developing, helping them develop their own capacity. And the chairman and the ranking member have already touched on the impact of the loans and the loan repayment and what that has in terms of the African countries and the recipient countries' ability to again care for themselves. So again, thank you for this hearing. Looking forward to the testimony, and again, perhaps if you all can touch on the contrast between U.S. and Western approach to aid and development versus the Chinese approach. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burr. I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished panel, beginning first with Gordon Chang, who I have listened to for years on radio, and matter of fact, I asked that he be here because I'm so impressed with his incisiveness, but also much of what he has written. He is the author of The Coming Collapse of China and Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, and a columnist for the Daily Beast. He's also an expert on China and Northeast Asia. Mr. Chang lived and worked in China and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades, most recently in Shanghai. He has spoken at a number of colleges and universities and given briefings to government entities such as the National Intelligence Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, State Department, and the Pentagon. His writings have appeared in news outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Weekly Standard. And Mr. Chang has testified before the Foreign Affairs Committee and the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. So we welcome him back to Capitol Hill and look forward to his expert analysis on this important topic. We'll then hear from Mr. Joshua Meservey, who is a senior policy analyst for Africa and the Middle East at the Heritage Foundation, a former Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia. He specializes in counterinsurgency, non-state armed groups, and security developments nexus. Prior to joining the Heritage Foundation, Mr. Meservey worked in the Church World Services Refugee Resettlement Operation in Kenya, as well as the U.S. Army Special Operations Command and the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. He has testified before the Senate and is a frequent commentator on African policy issues in a range of print and digital media outlets. We welcome him as well. We'll then hear from Scott Morris, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development and director of the U.S. Development Policy Initiative. Prior to joining the Center for Global Development, Mr. Morris served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Development, Finance, and Debt at the U.S. Treasury Department during the first term of the Obama administration. In that capacity, he has led U.S. engagement with a number of international financial institutions, such as the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank. He has also represented the U.S. government in the G20's Development Working Group and was the Treasury's +1 on the board of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Before his post at the U.S. Treasury, Mr. Morris was a senior staff member of the Financial Services Committee of the U.S. House, where he was responsible for the committee's international policy issues. It should be noted that Mr. Morris was asked last minute to fill in for the witness, although on his own right, we're very, very happy to have him. So I thank him for coming at such short notice. And then we'll hear from Anita Plummer, who's an assistant professor of African Studies whose research focuses on African political economy, emerging markets, transnationalism, and Sino-African relations. Her current book project, Close Encounters, Street-Level Perspective on Kenya and China, examines local, national, and transnational narratives in South-South cooperation. Before joining the faculty at Howard, Dr. Plummer taught international studies at Spelman College. She was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Cultures in Transnational Perspective program and visiting assistant professor of global studies and political science at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is also a fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Center, predoctoral fellow at the University of Virginia. Dr. Plummer received her PhD from Howard in Washington. So if I could now, Gordon Chang, you have the floor.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for this opportunity. My testimony focuses on China's views on sub-Saharan Africa, especially in relationship to Beijing's expanding ambitions. And I also look at this in the context of colonialism. I conclude that China is practicing a new form of colonialism and that China's relations with Africa threaten Americans' interests. Beijing looks at Africa as special. For instance, it says that more than half of its foreign assistance goes to the continent. Now, Beijing obviously wants favors in return, and clearly there is this strong connection between what a country will do for China and the amount of aid that it receives. China needs African support for a number of things, but especially because Xi Jinping, the foreign leader, wants to show that he is the commanding voice of the developing world. At one time, Beijing denied that it provided any sort of model for the developing world, but now it brags about it. And it's even branded it, calling it socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. Xi Jinping, however, has ambitions beyond just assisting the developing world. There are indications that he believes that not only should China's model be the world's model, but that China's leader be the world's leader. China, in its pronouncements recently, is making the case that it should be the world's only sovereign, a view that Chinese emperors maintain. And that, of course, brings us to China's relationships with Africa. Now, Beijing vehemently denies, as some influential African voices say, that China is practicing a form of colonialism or neocolonialism. Nonetheless, Beijing's use of this imperial-era language is inconsistent with the denial of its colonial ambitions. China, if it were free to implement its imperial system, would divest all other nations of sovereignty, and that, of course, is the essence of colonialism. The Chinese leadership, unfortunately, holds views that foster colonial mentality in the Chinese capital. And there are two of these that I'd like to just briefly mention. First of all, Chinese leaders have this view of a brutish conception of the world where the strong do what they want and the weak must comply. Second of all, to make matters worse, Chinese officials give the impression that they view African people as inferior to their own. And this was made painfully obvious during a 14-minute skit last month on China Central Television at the Spring Gala. The skit, which was seen by some 800 million viewers, depicted Kenyans as objects of derision and even as subhuman. It is therefore hard to think that China's leaders see Africans as equals, and these perceptions of inequality fuel the notion that they must hold neo-colonial attitudes. African nations, at least at first glance, are dealing with China freely, and so therefore China, of course, is not practicing a 19th century type of colonialism. Yet, of course, in our world, the nature of colonialism is changing. In China, by basing troops on the continent, by corrupting officials, by flooding local markets with Chinese manufactured goods, by sending workers to Africa, by straining local economies with trade imbalances, as well as by swamping countries in debt, which Ranking Member Bass mentioned in her opening remarks, have now begun to dominate the continent. Once it locks in countries and makes them dependent, Beijing gets their support for geopolitical goals. And one of these goals is undermining democracy. Africa is struggling to shake off the rule of the so-called big men, and it doesn't need any more failing states like China-supported Zimbabwe. Now, as the Zimbabwe example shows, Beijing is affecting the course of African development at a crucial period of its history. Some people believe that the United States doesn't have interests in Africa. Even if this were true, and it's not, but even if it were true, Africa gives China the ability to threaten the American homeland. As Chairman Smith mentioned, the Chinese now have a military base in Djibouti, their first overseas one, but they also want one at Walvis Bay in the South Atlantic. And the Chinese leaders have even been thinking about taking over an air base in the Azores. Now, from the Azores, China would be able to control the mouth of the Mediterranean, and their planes would be closer to New York than Pearl Harbor is to Los Angeles. A belligerent China in Asia is bad enough. A dangerous one close to our shores would be far worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. I'd like to now go to our Ms. Irby. Mr. Irby.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify. Thank you as well for highlighting one of the most important issues facing Africa, and by extension, U.S. interests in Africa. With your permission, I would like to submit my written testimony into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
I need to add that the views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Chairman, in the last 2 decades, China has built, by many measures, unparalleled influence in Africa. It has done so through an array of economic, military, and diplomatic initiatives. Beijing wants to secure a stable supply of natural resources and make money in Africa. Yet it is also seeking influence on the continent to support its rise to what it sees as its rightful place as a global superpower. The U.S. prefers cooperation to competition, but the U.S. and Chinese models are fundamentally at odds. And the danger for U.S. interests is if the illiberal economic and governance model the Chinese exemplify continues to gain ground in Africa. If it does, it would likely mean that U.S. and other countries' firms would be increasingly cut out of some of the growing economic opportunities on the continent. That the U.S.'s long-standing foreign policy goal of encouraging the global growth of democracy would be turned back in Africa in favor of Beijing's authoritarian model, and that China could supplant the U.S. in strategic areas of the continent. There are troubling signs that the Chinese model is gaining in Africa. Researchers found that as African countries' trade increases with China, they grow more likely to vote with Beijing against UN resolutions condemning human rights violations. Polls show that while the U.S. as a model of national development holds a slight lead over China in Africa, China is even in Southern and North Africa and leads in Central Africa. I want now to focus on a few of the ways China is building such influence. One part of Beijing's huge increase in economic activity in Africa has been issuing loans, as we've already been discussing this morning. In 2015, Chinese loans from the 3 years previous accounted for an estimated 1/3 of all recent debt in sub-Saharan Africa. This gives it significant influence with many countries. Djibouti, as we've also already been talking about, sits on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a global shipping choke point. It hosts a number of military bases, including China's first permanent overseas base and the U.S.'s Camp Lemonnier. China now holds Djiboutian debt worth about 60% of that country's GDP, giving it significant leverage over a country critical to U.S. military operations on the continent. The Chinese base will supposedly serve as a rest and resupply depot for its forces participating in anti-piracy patrols and support Chinese personnel serving in UN peacekeeping operations in Africa. The number of that personnel has skyrocketed to nearly 2,200 from only 20 in the 90s. China has recently enhanced other elements of its long-standing military ties with Africa. From 2012 to 2015, Beijing accounted for nearly 1/3 of the value of all arms deliveries to the continent. Today, 2/3 of African countries use some Chinese military equipment. In addition, China trains militaries and builds military training centers in various African countries. Across Africa, Beijing is also establishing Confucius Institutes, which are centers devoted to teaching Chinese culture and tradition, as well as pushing Beijing's narrative on topics such as Tibet and Taiwan. Senior Chinese officials have described these institutes as important to Beijing's efforts to promote a positive Chinese global image, thereby strengthening Chinese national power. In just over 10 years, the Chinese government has established 76 Confucius Institutes and classrooms in 38 African countries. Beijing is also training in China an increasing number of African politicians. These trainings sometimes cover decidedly illiberal topics, such as how to control public opinion. Other public diplomacy initiatives include Chinese medical teams conducting hundreds of African missions since 1963, and a hospital ship visiting at least 9 African countries since 2010. Some of Beijing's activities can be beneficial, such as filling part of Africa's huge infrastructure gap. Yet the U.S. should vigorously expand its own still significant influence in Africa to ensure that commitment to the rule of law, individual rights, and the free market is preeminent on the continent. To do so, the U.S. should, among other initiatives, reorient its development aid to Africa to focus on enhancing free markets and accountable and competent governance, deepen cooperation with like-minded allies active on the continent, such as the UK, Israel, and Japan, swiftly fill the vacant Africa-related positions in the U.S. government, and finally, seek opportunities, such as in counterterrorism, to cooperate with the Chinese while maintaining the appropriate level of wariness. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much for your testimony, and look forward to the questions, because I do have a number for you as well. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Morris.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, thank you for the opportunity to testify, even at the last minute. I appreciate it very much. I'd like to use my time to highlight some new research from me and my colleagues at the Center for Global Development, John Hurley and Galen Portalance, on the question of China's lending practices and their implications for debt distress in developing countries. I'll also offer some of my personal views on the implications of this research for U.S. policy. Our new work, which I've submitted to the committee along with my testimony, specifically looks at the debt implications of China's Belt and Road Initiative. While much of the initiative falls outside of Africa, we do identify a handful of African countries as part of Belt and Road. We also look broadly at Chinese practices associated with debt distress, which has particular relevance for African countries. We find that Chinese lending could lead to debt distress in at least 8 countries associated with Belt and Road due to the current debt profile of those countries, the volume of Chinese lending contemplated under the initiative, and the predominantly commercial terms of that lending. Djibouti, which we've already heard a lot about, is one of the most vulnerable of these countries. It is the site of China's only overseas military base and has been the recipient of large-scale Chinese lending and investment. Our analysis suggests that Djibouti's external debt, already very high for a low-income country, could rise to over 90% of GDP under the Belt and Road lending. Equally important, nearly all of this external debt, over 90%, will be owed to China. So if Djibouti faces a debt crisis, how is China likely to respond? The answer is we don't know, which speaks to why Chinese practice in this area is problematic. China's approach to debt relief isn't particularly transparent or predictable, yet transparency and predictability are critical to managing debt problems in an orderly way. This is why the work of the Paris Club of Creditors, which includes the United States along with other major creditor countries, rests on well-articulated rules and actions pursued on a collective basis. China is not a member of the Paris Club and has only participated in the club's agreements on a very limited basis. So what does all this mean for the United States? First, even as we highlight Chinese practices that are clearly problematic in the developing world, we also should acknowledge the degree to which Chinese financing is contributing and helping to spur growth in these economies. Ethiopia is a case where we see a mix of Chinese projects and investments, some that may not be sustainable or productive, alongside others that are clearly delivering an economic benefit to the country. So as long as this is the case, as it very well may be in a wide range of countries, then dire warnings from the United States are unlikely to find a receptive audience in the developing world. Instead, we should be specific in our criticism of Chinese lending practices and look for specific opportunities to engage the Chinese on reform. We would do well to continue to press the Chinese on alignment with global norms and practices on lending transparency, debt management, procurement standards, etc. Progress is frustratingly slow, but it's not entirely absent. As a member of the G20, China has signed on to important principles around sustainable financing, which includes commitments to lending transparency. U.S. officials should aim to steer these G20 commitments to operational practice. We should also prioritize our own engagement in the developing world. This means continuing to exercise leadership in the humanitarian and health sectors, as well as beefing up our development finance tools. On the latter, the proposed U.S. Development Finance Corporation, for which there is legislation now, would mark a positive step forward, I think. At the same time, we should be realistic about its utility as an answer to China. It is not likely to operate on a scale that rivals Chinese development finance institutions, and its private sector focus, while important, also limits its role in purely public infrastructure. Fortunately, we do have a ready-made set of tools in our toolkit when it comes to deploying high-quality development finance across Africa and globally. U.S. leadership in institutions like the World Bank and the African Development Bank is of critical value, and I worry that current policy fails to exploit the full potential of these institutions. These banks define best practice in the very areas that concern us about Chinese lending, from setting appropriate lending terms to ensuring open and transparent procurement rules. If we are worried about China's growing presence in a wide array of countries globally, then now is not the time to be shrinking the footprint of these institutions. So, rather than resisting the World Bank's call for more capital this year, I would suggest that U.S. officials take whatever the number that the bank has requested and double it, and then repeat this exercise across all of the multilateral development banks. This certainly may sound overly ambitious, but would only account for just a few more percentage points of our foreign aid budget. Whether or not we can muster this level of ambition, it will be critical for U.S. policy to be defined by a positive agenda in the developing world. It is a losing proposition to limit ourselves to the role of China's chief critic if we have nothing to offer in the alternative. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for your testimony and insights. I'd like to now call on our last and final witness, Dr. Plummer.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass and the honorable members of this committee, Congressman Barra. It is an honor to appear before you today to discuss China's engagement with Africa. I want to begin with a note that I think will contextualize my remarks. Africa is a diverse continent with 54 countries, which, except for Liberia and Ethiopia, share a legacy of colonialism, which has shaped political, economic institutions, culture, and its position in the global system. When discussing China's engagement with Africa, some generalizations may be appropriate, but to have substantive discussion, we should consider the features of the commitments on a case-by-case basis. So in the spirit of specificity, I will focus my testimony on Kenya's ties with China to hopefully illustrate some of the nuances and ambiguities of China's role in Africa. In 2008, the Kenyan government implemented its Vision 2030 development program. The program's goal is to transform Kenya into a newly industrializing middle-income country with far-reaching political, economic, and social reforms. The government has undertaken a robust agenda that focuses on large-scale infrastructure. Coincidentally, China's Belt and Road Initiative, a project aimed at developing overland and maritime trade routes connecting Asian, European, and African countries, corresponds with Kenya's goal to secure its role as a gateway to Eastern and Central Africa. Kenya's geostrategic position provides much desired access to consumer markets, as well as the facilitation of extractive industries in South Sudan, Uganda, and the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Infrastructure is the third largest sector that the Chinese are engaged in on the continent of Africa, following mining and the financial services. On the macro level, the rationale is that investments in telecommunications, energy, and transport will increase foreign direct investment in the country and region. On the micro level, there is an assumption that large-scale capital investments in infrastructure will promote economic growth by integrating rural areas with urban business centers. For Kenya, investments in transport are viewed as an imperative because its landlocked neighbors, such as Tanzania, South Sudan, and Uganda, rely on its road and rail network, along with its ports in Mombasa and the one slated to be built in Lamu. Conversely, the East Africa region, home to 230 million consumers, is an attractive destination for products, particularly from China. Foreign direct investment by emerging economies such as China has been a vital part of Kenya's growth strategy. Kenyan policymakers believe that the delivery of mega transport projects will boost their competitiveness in the global market and increase possibilities for high-value production in different sectors. However, China's engagement with Africa has included significant debt finance investments in transport infrastructure, This engagement brings inevitable conflicts between diverse actors from China and local Kenyan communities, who must contend with the ambiguities of China's role in Africa and its implications for labor markets and sites of production. Within the Kenyan context, where exogenous factors have historically driven development, infrastructure delivery is a political process. And in the absence of quality decision-making that is participatory and transparent, government and business elites overlook criticisms of this model. These critiques include those that you're well aware of: debt traps, environmental degradation, lack of skills transfer, and so on. These projects are primarily financed by Chinese banks or institutions, and its financing is tied to Chinese companies being awarded the contracts. African governments value turnkey projects and the accompanied funding. African leaders applaud China's responsiveness to requests for development projects. The largest one in the country to date is the standard gauge railway. However, in response to high rates of youth unemployment, particularly in Kenya, youth have protested for jobs, decent wages, safe working conditions, and environmental sustainability, all promises made by both Kenyan and Chinese governments when the projects were announced. Second, infrastructure projects aimed at supporting extractive industries or ensuring Chinese-made goods easily reach African markets is too narrow an approach to economic development. It may be convenient to argue that China's presence is neocolonial, but that fails to consider African agency in determining the scope and scale of their relations with China. China's strategy is rooted in its imperative to access resources and markets, to appear to be a global responsible power, and to isolate Taiwan's role in Africa. Conversely, African leaders want to use China's presence in their nations to boost their political legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. The issue at hand is how to assess the extent to which elites in Africa and China are fostering policies and practices that further extract from people's livelihoods and constrict political space. A dangerous trend that we do not want to see in African nations follows what we have observed in China with Xi Jinping's efficient consolidation of power. Currently, there is a problem with the lack of transparency in Sino-African engagements, which results in mutually reinforcing practices among African and Chinese elites of acting autonomously from their citizens. And this is despite a robust campaign of public diplomacy in Africa by Chinese diplomats who frame China as non-paternalistic and non-hegemonic. I want to add that there's also discussion in Africa on the implications of China's role in hindering the democratic project and how shifts in U.S. policy may further undermine grassroots efforts to promote African democracy. For example, in an op-ed published yesterday in one of Kenya's most widely read papers, the author, Wachira Maina, wrote, quote, "China does not have a democracy agenda. Its investments in Africa and its flexible apolitical diplomacy have allowed its clients to resist the political terms that the West once imposed for aid on the continent." He goes on to write, "Fearing that it could lose out if it stuck to ethical foreign policy in the face of Chinese incursion, the West has changed its posture. Western diplomats now talk stability, not democracy. Elections are okay if they are peaceful rather than free and fair. Quiet diplomacy is increasingly favored over visible, public, and the frank approach of the 1990s. With China in the foreground, the West bargains from a weak position." In conclusion, the model of political authoritarianism and economic liberalism is appealing to most African leaders, but African publics interpret this model differently. The assumption made by elites in China and Africa is that liberal economic frameworks are the most efficient tool for development, and their investments in large-scale transport and energy infrastructure support that view. The other assumption made by the leadership in China and Africa is that institutions built on democratic norms are inefficient and antithetical to growth. As the U.S. considers its engagement in Africa in an increasingly crowded political and business environment, i.e. China, India, and Brazil, it may consider shifting attention to supporting development from within. That is, supporting efforts to create space for African-based entrepreneurs to flourish and for civil society to continue to push for political pluralism and inclusivity. Thank you.
very much, Dr. Plummer. To begin the questioning, let me begin by asking Mr. Chang and any others who would like to jump in on these questions. In your testimony, first of all, let me just preface that I believe, and I do co-chair the China Commission with Marco Rubio. We just had another hearing just a few days ago on Tibet and the tightening noose on the Tibetan people under Xi Jinping, which has been bad but is getting worse. He does the same thing with the Christian churches, the Falun Gong, religious groups of all kinds, the Uyghurs, as well as with NGOs, which now have a very much tightened space within which to operate, all under Xi Jinping. Our annual report, which we put out every year, it's a bipartisan report, 9 members of the House, 9 members of the Senate, and 5 of the executive branch, was the most scathing we've ever had since the inception of the China Commission, again underscoring that Xi Jinping is truly in a race to the bottom with North Korea when it comes to human rights. Why is that important? Of course, because their model, which they are seeking to export, and until recently, until the changes and hoped for changes in Zimbabwe, they got along very well with Robert Mugabe and others like him, but not so with more democratically elected African countries. So my first questions would be about this threat to good governance. Do you see it? You've all spoken about the debt. I remember under George W. Bush and Bono and others in this Congress, bipartisan way, we all worked to try to help highly indebted countries get out from under through debt relief, and it continued for many, many years. But it seems like that may be turning a corner, and as was pointed out in testimony today, the connection of those debts, or those loans, I should say, to extractive industries and the like, and projects is very, very high. So the first question would be about, do the Chinese pay a fair price to Chinese companies or government companies in China for the products that they sell, whether it be minerals, oil, whatever it might be, wood? Is there a longer-term cost? Because that's not immediately apparent. The debt forgiveness, when does that reach a critical mass? Is it approaching that in terms of, loan sharks? It's over time that it becomes more troubling. And if there's all kinds of strings attached, and as was said during today's testimony by Mr. Mercervi, the no strings attached approach applies to a lot of things, especially to human rights and good governance issues, Tibet, Taiwan. Mr. Chang, you pointed out that you made several very, very powerful statements that the dealings between Beijing and African states seems to be tainted by both corruption and subtle forms of coercion. You might want to elaborate on that if you would. You also pointed out that China is spreading its economic and political model to Africa. There are some people who thought in the beginning, not me and probably not anybody at this table, that it was not a package deal, that the bad governance model follows it. You also made a point that Xi Jinping's ambitions are beyond helping the developing world. There are indications he, in fact, wants China's model to be the world's model, and that the Chinese leader should be the world's leader. And you point out that Xi suggests that the world would be peaceful should Beijing rule it as an all-under-heaven approach, obviously, using their words. You use the word Tianjia, if you could explain that further. And I would ask you, I've done a lot of reading about the Japanese. My father fought in New Guinea and the Philippines. He was a combat infantryman. So that issue of the Japanese, the why of it, has always fascinated me, troubled me, like it does so many. The Chinese, or Japanese, I should say, have this idea that they called it the 8 corners of the world under one roof, which wasn't just Imperial Japan, but it predated that they had this almost divine right to encircle the earth with their ideology and their governance. One of the reasons, maybe the reason for their aggression against first Asia and then elsewhere. the comparisons, if there are any, with China today may not be religiously based. They're not claiming Hirohito to be divine. They're not saying Xi Jinping is divine. But they seem to have an ideology that says they are destined to rule the world. And I look everywhere, from Europe, Latin America. This subcommittee deals with human rights all over the world, and the Chinese influence is profound. Again, it's no strings attached. So I wonder if you could speak to that possible connection, or are there already comparatives there?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. One of the most striking elements of Xi Jinping, in addition to the consolidation of power that Dr. Plummer talked about, really has been his ambitions for China. And in this, he's been using language recently that indicates that he believes that China should be the world's only sovereign, a proposition which sounds ludicrous, but nonetheless, we have to look at what he's actually been saying. So over the course of a decade, he's been using language of all under heaven, which is the concept that China's emperors for 2 millennia used. We saw some of these in some of the words that were used during the slogans for the 2008 Summer Olympics. This became very clear in his 2017 New Year's message, where he talked about the world being all under heaven, would be happy if we were one family. And then, if all of this weren't clear enough, in September of last year, Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, published an article in Study Times, which is the paper of the Communist Party's Central Party School. And in that article, Wang Yi says that Xi Jinping thought, that's a body of work, a way the Chinese refer to an ideology, that Xi Jinping thought transcends and replaces 300 years of Western thinking on international relations. Well, if you take 300 years back, you're just about at 1648, which is the Treaty of Westphalia, which established the basis of the world's international system today of competing sovereign states. So one you can look at in terms of the tianxia, the all under heaven language that Xi Jinping has been using, and looking at Wang Yi's Study Times article, it's pretty clear the way the Chinese are looking at these things. And indeed, China's House scholars study this concept. Now, as I mentioned, this is breathtaking, but this is what they're telling us. Now, you know, in terms of comparisons with the Chinese don't have this notion of divinity as much as the Japanese do in the Shinto religion, but nonetheless, you can see the idea that there is one power that's supposed to be in the world that will make the world peaceful and safe, and that just happens to be Japan in the 1930s and China in our time. And so we have to be, of course, there are differences, but when you combine this with China's views of Africans on a personal level, this becomes extremely dangerous. Now, of course, you know, many African countries have benefited from certain aspects of what China has done. But what we have also seen is China trying to use low-cost loans basically to encourage governments to spend freely, to create the crises of the future, these debt crises. We have these in a number of countries that were mentioned so far. And indeed, at this very moment, Tanzania is trying to restructure its debt and having discussions with Beijing and with multilateral institutions. And China, to a certain extent, is undermining what those multilateral institutions are trying to do. So when you put that together with the low-level corruption, sometimes high-level corruption, it is against a very difficult picture for Africa, and one which the United States needs to speak out about.
You did, in your testimony before going to the other witnesses, talk about China's words appear ominous and not benign, and you used the word colonial master. You also pointed out, and matter of fact, Ms. Survey pointed out the Confucius Institutes and how troubling they are, and the fact that so many African leaders are being brought to China for schooling and you know, just to train up the next generation of leaders. Again, the bad governance model. And as far as I know, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which tries to mitigate bribery and the like. Not so with China, as far as I know. I've never seen anything that would even come close to suggesting they had such a thing. So if you could answer those, then I'll yield to my good friend, Ms. Bass.
The colonial master language is really the result of China trying to divest other nations of sovereignty, because that is the essence of colonialism. Today, one can argue about the nature of China's relations with the countries on the continent, and of course, as Dr. Plummer's pointed out, those relations differ from country to country. But we do see certain trends which concern us, and we've talked about the debt, because through debt, China gains a hold over political systems in various countries. And we've seen this not just in Africa. This is something that they've done, for instance, on our own continent with Venezuela, something that has a direct effect very close to our home, where China is now using the renegotiation process to gain advantage in our own continent. Of course, they do that in Africa as well. One can argue that a country can do whatever it wants to gain power, but nonetheless, when we put all of these things together, it paints an extremely disturbing picture. So we can't look at just low-cost loans in isolation. We can't look at just Xi Jinping's thoughts on the Treaty of Westphalia in isolation. We can't look at the corruption that China has fostered or the bad governance that it tends to promote. You put all of that together and the picture is one of danger, not only for Africans, but for others as well.
Yeah, I'll address a couple of those questions. One is the fair price for resources that you referenced earlier. And the answer is that we don't know, because so frequently these arrangements are very opaque, and that's one of the criticisms that you'll hear even among the African public, or usually opposition politicians will make this point. No one quite knows what China is paying for access to certain resources. And even with some of the large infrastructure projects, we mentioned the standard gauge railway in China, or in Kenya, excuse me. Those too are starting to come under scrutiny. There's growing concern, I think, in Kenya that the standard gauge railway is a white elephant. There was 3 newspaper articles about this just earlier this week, where they were concerned the Kenyan government trying to compel importers to use the standard gauge railway because they still didn't want to use it. And of course, the specter is looming that they're going to be stuck with an extraordinarily expensive piece of infrastructure that isn't going to return that isn't going to produce a return on investment. There's also another example in Uganda where a road was built by the same Chinese company that built a road from Addis to Eritrea, and the road in Kenya was twice the cost, essentially. And then the one in Addis, from Addis to Eritrea. And as I mentioned, it was built by the same company, and part of the problem was the contract was demanded single sourcing. So meaning a Chinese company, which ended up being this company that had been involved in the Ethiopia project, got the contract, and that's caused a lot of consternation. Why, again, was this road in Uganda so much more expensive? So there's starting to be these questions asked, not just about are African countries getting fair price for their resources, but also are they getting good value on these massive infrastructure projects?
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to address one question you raised around debt forgiveness, and you mentioned the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Initiative, HIPIC, which I have to say the U.S. Congress really demonstrated tremendous leadership on for the international community at the time. And I think it is instructive because if you look at what made HIPIC work at the time, it had a lot to do with who these countries owed money to. It was essentially the World Bank, the IMF, and the G7. And you had the possibility and the reality of those actors getting together and deciding to act in concert to relieve debt in the face of evidence that this was a tremendous burden on these poor countries, mostly in Africa. If you look at the profile of debt of countries today that we're worrying about, again, many in Africa, it looks very different. In fact, increasingly, it is not the G7 at all. They're simply not there as creditors. It is still the World Bank, the IMF, but it is China, and then it is a set of other emerging actors. And so far, we're not seeing any evidence that these actors, and primarily the Chinese, have an interest in engaging in this kind of collective engagement around considering debt relief. It's not that the Chinese have not done debt relief. They do it on an ad hoc basis. In some ways, they do it in a very traditional way that looks like the way that the Paris Club might do it. But then other times they do things that frankly look, let's call it peculiar, in terms of debt for equity swaps, debt for land swaps. And it's that set of activities that really, from my perspective, is a cause for concern and does worry me about, the potential for wide-scale debt problems and what will the international community be able to do this time and around, given the state of play compared to what it looked like 15 years ago.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. One question I would like for all of you to address in a minute is, what's the solution here? Because to me, as Mr. Morris said, it's easy to sit here and be real critical of China, but what leverage do we have over China to get China to act differently? And, Mr. Morris, you were just talking about 15 years ago and the role that the U.S. played, and it seems as though maybe we have an opportunity to play that role again by mobilizing the international community. It might not be that the debt is owed to the IMF and G7, I believe you said it wasn't, but maybe the world community has leverage, because I just don't understand what the solution is to me. I mean, to me, the solution is the U.S. and us stepping up. I don't know if you four have other ideas as to what the solution is, but I could look at how the Chinese could easily say several things about our involvement, from the military to youth leaders to all of that, which I think our involvement is very positive, especially in terms of training the next generation of leaders. But I am concerned about the lack of our involvement and then the direction that we're going in terms of the cuts to the State Department and all of that. But there is the independent private sector that I am hoping, and I'm sure the chairman is too, would step up more and be more involved in Africa's infrastructure. So maybe each of you could tell me what the solution is that's different than the U.S. stepping up. What leverage do we have to tell China to stop acting the way it's acting in the continent of Africa?
Well, Ranking Member Bass, I think the United States has enormous leverage over China. We have a much bigger economy. We have a stable economy. China right now is heading to a debt crisis. And there are a number of different ways that we can deal with the Chinese. One of them is just a very simple one. We could enforce U.S. law against North Korean banks that are laundering money, Chinese banks that are laundering money through New York on behalf of North Korea. I mean, a threat to, for instance, declared Bank of China a primary money laundering concern under Section 311 of the Patriot Act could rock the Chinese financial system.
Can we do that, Mr. Chairman? Sanction the Bank of China?
I think that we can, because there's evident proof that there is Bank of China's involvement in, for instance, devising and operating a money laundering scheme for the North Koreans in Singapore. This was in a UN panel of experts report for the year 2016. There's other evidence that Bank of China has been involved in money laundering for the North Koreans in other locations. And Bank of China, as big as it is not the biggest Chinese bank. But the point is not so much, this does not relate to Africa. But we do have...
That is what I'm referring to.
Excuse me?
That is what I'm referring to.
Yeah. We can do it. We have the authority to do it. Matter of fact, we should be doing it, because we shouldn't allow anybody, especially Beijing, to use our financial system in ways that violate American law.
Okay.
But to answer your question in terms of Africa, China's influence in Africa is largely because it's got these economic relationships, not only just extracting minerals, but also selling goods in China, in Africa. And we have a very different system. Our companies don't say yes when the President of the United States calls up, because they very well can say no. But that's not the Chinese system. When you have a big Chinese enterprise or a big Chinese bank, they have to do what they are told by the party.
Right, and I'm not doubting you. That's fine. But my question was, and you answered it in part with the Bank of China. I don't think we're going to do that, but you answered part of it. What is the solution outside of us stepping up? And maybe I'll pass it on to Mr. Yeah, go ahead.
Quickly, I think democracy promotion, that was very important.
That we cut. Go ahead.
Also, our aid, for instance, is not building these big buildings, for instance, like the African Union headquarters, which was bugged by the Chinese. But our aid has been more people-oriented. It's developing in local communities, clean water, vaccines, all the rest of it.
Yeah, and I have a problem with how we do our aid, too, because I don't think our aid promotes self-sufficiency of African countries that I believe have the capacity to do a lot of those things themselves.
And we should be doing more of those things that do promote self-sufficiency, because they're extremely popular among people. And this is a struggle for hearts and minds. So that's where I would concentrate our efforts. And of course, I think, it's an all of the above issue where, if we should be putting more money into the IMF, yeah, let's do that. Let's do all of these things. But I like the idea of essentially the way we work with countries, at the local level, because that's important for people-to-people relationships. And the Peace Corps is a very important initiative in that regard.
Yeah, I agree with your fundamental point that the best way to approach this challenge is to enhance American activities.
Pull your microphone up a little bit. It's hard to
sorry. I agree with your fundamental point that the best way to deal with this challenge is to enhance American activity, because we do still have immense influence on the continent. We give, last year, or in 2016 rather, we gave $10 billion in overseas development assistance to Africa. So that alone buys us immense leverage. Now, I don't think we've used it as well as we should have.
Right.
But to the core of your question of what leverage do we have over China, we don't. So China cares deeply about its international image, for instance. So I would point to the ivory ban that recently the Chinese government implemented in China, and I think they became embarrassed about the fact that Chinese demand for ivory had been driving this poaching epidemic across the African continent. And so eventually they started to do something. Now, whether they're going to continue, whether it is a truly good faith effort, we'll see. But at least in my mind, it was an incremental step at the very least. So international image issues, there's a limit to if it conflicts with their core interests, they don't care how they look. But so there is a limit to that, but that's something. Prosecuting corruption, there was, again, a recent case. The Department of Justice laid charges against an emissary from a major multinational Chinese company, a private company that had bribed Chadian officials and Ugandan officials, I think, for access to oil rights. So seizing those opportunities. But fundamentally, China and Africa is a fact of life, and it will be for the foreseeable future. So, and there are good elements to Chinese activity. Now, there's all these negative things that I think are best dealt with by enhancing our own activities, as you said in your opening remarks and in your question, and just burnishing the attractiveness of the American model, which still has a lot of resonance on the continent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I would say what's critical is, and what I'm worried about, is that we are not maintaining a level of engagement directly with the Chinese that helps make progress on these issues. And as I said in my testimony, however painfully slow that might be, the absence of the engagement isn't going to do anything positive. And I would point to one example. So you have something called the Strategic Dialogue. It's changed names over the years, but it started in the Bush administration, carried forward in the Obama administration. And over the course of the years, it addressed many different issues, one of which was this issue about debt problems in low-income countries and China's behavior. Just a few years ago, the signals were that China was very close to joining the Paris Club of Creditors, which I referred to in my testimony as a really important forum for dealing with debt problems and doing it in a responsible way. What I see now is no evidence that that dialogue is a priority anymore for this administration, and statements from Treasury officials that it simply isn't a priority. And from my perspective, we've probably lost that opportunity as a result to keep that momentum up on questions like responsible lending practices.
Thank you. Yes?
One that I've been grappling with for years in terms of what we can do on our end. One, in terms of leverage, the U.S. is still favored over China. So opinion polls that have taken place in nearly every sub-Saharan African country by the Pew Global Attitudes Project and Afrobarometer shows that U.S. values are still favored over the values of authoritarian bureaucracy that are heralded from China. So when we look at leverage, we have to look at it on the level of the elites that we're engaging, but also the masses of people who are impacted by our policies. So initiatives like the YALI initiative, I think, is very encouraging to support young entrepreneurs, civil society leaders in developing strategies to be able to bring pressure on their governments from below. I think we should also look at debt models and consider debt forgiveness. Billions of dollars are leaving the continent every year, servicing debt, but also linked to illicit financial flows. The U.S. has a very robust system in that we can look at where African leaders are stashing billions of dollars offshore, including in banks in the United States.
And buying property here.
And buying property here. Yep. This is money that belongs to the masses of African people. So in terms of U.S. leverage and building on the favorable image that the U.S. already has in Africa, I think it will be much welcomed if our policies really consider how the masses would be impacted by our policies. Finally, I think the Millennium Challenge Corporation had a very good model in terms of money going to development projects in Africa being given to African companies to carry out the projects. So expanding MCC, also considering expanding AGOA and preferential trade treatment. What products are given preferential treatment is also a very tangible area that the U.S. can improve its policy on.
Thank you. And just to wrap up, Mr. Chair, I would agree with you in terms of the U.S. being valued over the Chinese, because some of the roads we're talking about and infrastructure we know collapses. But, you know, again, I think it falls on us. One of the other issues that I don't believe you raised, or maybe I missed the various panelists, is one of the problems is labor. So, you know, in communities well, my community, for example, part of my district, people get upset if there's a major project and no one on the project is from the community. I can only imagine what Africans feel who are unemployed and see Chinese labor come in. All of those, to me, are reasons why I think we should focus on the U.S. and increasing our footprint on the continent and leaving our viewpoint of the continent. Our viewpoint of the continent is from a charity perspective. What you watch on late-night TV on Africa in terms of the commercials, until we leave that viewpoint and join the rest of the world in looking at the continent of Africa from the point of view of partnership and opportunity, and then promote U.S. businesses to do business on the continent. We can sit and complain about China all we want, but to me, it's a question of us stepping up. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Chairman Shabbat.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Last month, it was brought to my attention that the tribal rivalry between the Dinka and Nuer people in South Sudan has resurfaced. I've heard reports that the Chinese government is directly benefiting from this conflict by extracting resources with virtually no benefit for the people who inhabit the land, and possibly even using enslaved locals for their labor. Could any of you speak to this, or have you heard of Chinese engaging in similar practices in other parts of Africa?
Well, I'll take a stab. So I follow South Sudan quite closely, and yes, the Chinese companies are heavily involved in that country, specifically in the oil industry, which is one of the areas of contestation in the country, because obviously it's lucrative to control the oil fields. I again, I don't know what the specific terms of the contract are because they're very rarely ever made public. So it's very difficult to know what are the Chinese paying and things of that nature. But I suspect that in this case, given how thoroughly corrupt the South Sudanese regime is, and how its primary concern is to prosecute the war in South Sudan, that it would happily strike a very poor deal with these Chinese companies in order to have some sort of in order to earn some money at all, because they're under very difficult financial strain. To the question about slave labor, I haven't encountered or heard of that happening in South Sudan specifically, but one of the concerns of Chinese engagement on the continent is the standards for labor, and frequently they're not up to the standards that a Western firm would demand or uphold. So and this has caused conflict in other parts of the continent where there's even been deaths when miners have struck, for instance, at Chinese mines and then been shot. So I wouldn't at all be surprised if there are serious labor abuses in the South Sudanese oil fields as well.
Thank you very much. Would any other panel members want to add anything to that? If not, I'll move to another question. Okay, I'll go ahead. China is notorious for undermining Taiwan every chance it gets. I was one of the original founders of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus and have been working on Taiwan issues for many years now. How has Beijing leveraged its influence in Africa against Taiwan? What impact does increasing Chinese influence in Africa have on Taiwan's global standing? For example, pressing countries across the globe, including in Africa, to drop their recognition of Taiwan. Would anybody want to address that? I saw you nodding, Mr. Meservey, so if you'd like to.
Sure. I addressed this in my written testimony. In 2005, there were 7 African countries that recognized Taiwan. There's 2 left now. And that's the result of a campaign by the Chinese on the continent. Sao Tome and Principe was the most recent African country to cut ties. That was just late last year. And they immediately received very large Chinese loans. The Chinese have never given loans to countries that maintain ties with Taiwan. There's only 2 left, as I said, Burkina Faso and Swaziland. And I suspect, I didn't go back before 2005, but if you went further back, I'm sure there were many more African countries with ties to Taiwan that have steadily cut them off because of Beijing's inducements.
Thank you. And then finally, when China builds goodwill, when it does various projects in Africa, but really around the world, it always does so with the expectation that its partner will disproportionately favor China. There's always something in it, much more for China. You might think you're getting something out of it and it's sort of free, but it's never free with China. I know you've all addressed this in your testimony, but to what extent will Chinese investment perhaps make various countries in Africa less hospitable to Western businesses and organizations because of the way they've undermined free and open markets, rule of law, the way you're actually supposed to do things? Anybody who's Mr. Chang?
Yeah. I mean, that generally has been Beijing's ultimate intention. You know, when Chinese companies first go to a country, they can't do that. But what we have seen in Africa and elsewhere, that when there's this critical mass, that Beijing does have the ability to use its economic power for what you've mentioned, to undermine. The whole concept of Beijing undermining good governance in Africa and elsewhere has just been so clear. And we've seen the effects of it in countries like Zimbabwe. So with the big men in Africa, they do have Chinese support, and that's an indication where Beijing would go if it indeed had more influence.
Very good. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Let me just ask a few following questions or follow-up and final questions, and thank you again for your very, very incisive answers. Could any of you shed any light as to what the relationship is with the Chinese government and the African Union? What are their goals? What are they trying to influence, if anything, in your view, with the AU?
So the Chinese government built the African Union headquarters, so that's obvious. It's interesting that the Chinese government prefers not to engage in negotiations with blocks, power blocks. They prefer to negotiate on a bilateral basis. And that's obvious. Anytime a group of countries negotiate as a bloc, especially countries that aren't as integrated, like in Africa, that will put China at a better advantage in terms of negotiating trade deals. There are representatives from the Chinese government at the African Union headquarters. Aside from that, I'm not sure of how the Chinese government uses the African Union to lobby African leadership, or what access they have in the African Union, because they have their embassies in each country that they have ties with. And I would imagine that on a bilateral basis within each country, the relationships are stronger outside of the AU.
Thank you. Ms. Misserve, you pointed out in your testimony, and I quote, echoes of Mao's shrewd practice of building influence with rising African leaders and political parties remain today in Beijing's program for granting young and sometimes senior African politicians scholarships to attend trainings in China. You point out that in 2016, China announced it would invite 1,000 more African politicians to receive training. Do you, or any of you, have any sense what that training actually is? What is the duration of it? You know, is it indoctrination all wedded together with what? Do we know?
Like many elements of Chinese engagement with Africa, it's a bit opaque, but there's no doubt that some, and I referenced this in the written testimony, some of these representatives of African political parties are receiving training on how the CCP organizes its own party, for instance. The EPRDF, which is the ruling coalition in Ethiopia, which in your opening remarks you referenced, its deeply authoritarian tendencies, has received training on how to control public opinion, including relations with the media. So I think the thrust of a lot of these trainings, and there are objectively benign trainings like around agricultural competencies and such, but the thrust for a lot of the parties, the African parties that are interested, and I think there's been at least 7 ruling African parties that have participated in these trainings, is learning how to sort of learn how to dominate the country, frankly, as the CCP does. And I think it's deeply worrying when you have parties like the Jubilee Party from Kenya. Kenya is a democracy, but they are going to receive trainings. We don't know the content of all of them, but we suspect that the CCP is training parties like Jubilee and the EPRDF and SWAPO in how to deepen their own and centralize their authority.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I think it's important that we not underestimate the degree to which China is becoming a desirable place to obtain technical knowledge. They are an increasingly sophisticated economy, investing heavily in areas of R&D, and to the degree that they are, actively seeking to attract students from other countries, let's recognize that's our model. And I do worry that at the moment that feels a little vulnerable here. And I think it's one of the ways in which we've been so effective in the world is that we've been particularly open to foreign students who come to our universities. And so that, as a model that is now growing in China, we need to recognize its value to us as well.
But is there any kind of political baggage that goes along with that? Because we know for a fact that the Confucius Institutes and many of our colleges and universities who have campuses on mainland China are highly restricted in what they're able to do, and that there is a political baggage, a weight that is imposed by having such an institute, for example, on a U.S. campus. And we are looking further into it on the China Commission. Like I said before, we've asked the GAO to really rigorously study what the parameters are, what are they teaching, because like I said in my opening, it's like a free gift to a university to have, what seems to be a value added, but really in real terms probably is not. It's soft power.
Mr. Chairman, just on one aspect, I don't know the nature of the training that the Chinese are offering, but the one big drawback that China suffers is that African students and others have been the targets of really ugly racism in China, and that must have tarred the image. And one of the great things about the United States is just the openness of it, and so that when students come here, they generally have a very positive view of the United States. And we have to work at that, of course. But Beijing does suffer from it because it does have the money to bring everybody to Beijing, but it doesn't have the ability to change Chinese attitudes. And those attitudes, I think, are the biggest impediment to China making actually more inroads into the African societies.
On one trip to the DR Congo, I remember meeting with a group of lawmakers who told me that the Chinese are very adept at making sure that the roads go as close to minerals and that which they have their eyes on, and often have access to it at a very small or negligible price. They also said the roads weren't that good. What is your sense in terms of the quality of the goods? We know that in Kenya, a bridge several months ago collapsed, and Kenyatta had been there visiting just 2 weeks before it collapsed. A couple of dozen people were severely injured as a result. What is the quality of those goods? And finally, just let me ask if you could, Mr. Chang, in your book, The Coming Collapse of China and elsewhere, you have questioned the sustainability of China's debt in the long term, in part due to its inefficient lending to state-owned enterprises. And I'm wondering how the level of indebtedness of African nations, in particular, those rated by the Center for Global Development as being potential high risks of distress, namely Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, others, factor into China's own financial health. What would be the effect on China's lending institutions of a default or a restructuring? And how might you think that might rattle the markets globally?
Mr. Chairman, we're seeing this not played out in Africa, but certainly being played out in Venezuela, where there is somewhere between $17 to $20 billion of debt. And to borrow your term, we just don't know the full extent of that debt, but we do know that China is in difficult straits because they don't know how to do this. Part of it is because maybe of a lack of experience, but also because they realize that the more money they put into Venezuela, the more difficult it becomes as a bigger problem. And indeed, in the last year or so, they have not been extending additional advances. Now, they're going to play this all out in connection with Djibouti, as you mentioned, and also with Tanzania right now with the debt restructuring. Beijing has a lot of money, but it also has a lot of commitments. And this is the whole concept of imperial overstretch. And we see this playing out in China's relations with countries around the world, especially in Africa, where they have gone out and made very large commitments, but have not oftentimes been able to fulfill them. And that is largely because they've got too big ambitions. They say that they have $3.2 trillion of foreign exchange reserves, but that money is not unencumbered. They've been using a fair amount of this money for Belt and Road projects, which are not sustainable. I practiced law in Hong Kong at a time where anything that could be financed was financed by the private sector. What China is doing with Belt and Road right now is financing those things that nobody would have ever touched. And they wouldn't have touched them for good reason. Beijing is going to see all of these projects, well, not all of them, but many of these projects having to be refinanced on terms that are unfavorable to the Chinese, largely because these projects are just not economic. We see this especially in Latin America right now, where you've had two very large Chinese projects crater, the Interocean Canal at Nicaragua, and also the Atlantic to Pacific Railroad. China hasn't done, I think, anything as large as that in Africa, which has been such spectacular failures, but we've seen smaller projects not go forward in similar fashion.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you all for your testimony today. Let me ask you all, how much does China use, aside from their projects, right, like the ones they're doing in Latin America and some of the projects in Africa, what kind of development aid do they offer to the countries in the way that the United States has USAID, for example?
I think it's the common view is that they don't have an aid model. I don't think that's entirely correct. They do have what we would consider foreign aid. Official development assistance is the terminology. It is very small relative to the other types of financing that they do. It is growing.
And why do you think that they haven't used that? They haven't adopted the same model? Is it that they can't afford it, or they just don't believe in it? What's your best
I would say,
assessment?
I mean, what I would hear from Chinese counterparts over the years consistently is, we are not a rich country, we are not an aid provider, we ourselves are a poor country. Now, they've had to evolve that message as reality.
It's the second largest economy in the world.
And both, so the message has evolved, but also the reality is changing. They are increasing their levels of foreign aid. On something like the Belt and Road Initiative, which is infrastructure oriented, you are seeing an aid component allocated to things like technical assistance, project preparation.
And let me ask you, I have a question. There has been stories recently about cobalt mining in Africa. And to what extent do Chinese companies comply with international standards on child labor when extracting natural resources in African countries, such as cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? If anybody can address that.
Yeah, the cobalt issue in Eastern DRC is a fascinating one. The Chinese have moved strategically, I would say, to dominate the global supply chain for cobalt. Cobalt, of course, is a critical mineral in the creation of lithium-ion batteries, which may well be extraordinarily important, even more so than now, particularly if driverless cars becomes as big of an industry as many people think it will. So as far as child labor standards specifically, I'm not sure what the Chinese companies that are involved in cobalt mining have for those sorts of standards. As we've mentioned throughout this hearing, though, there's no doubt that Chinese companies do not subscribe to the same level of labor standards as Western firms do, for instance. So whether that translates specifically into using child labor at a cobalt mine, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if the answer is yes.
Also, China recently opened its first overseas military base in Djibouti. What do you expect the purpose of this base is, and where do you see China's expanding footprint in the region? And do you see them expanding militarily in Africa beyond this one base?
Beijing has indicated that it clearly wants to dominate the Indian Ocean. And in order to do that, it does need logistical bases. And so it's no surprise that their first overseas base is essentially to support the People's Liberation Army Navy. And it's no surprise that it's in the Indian Ocean. The thing that I'm concerned about is the Chinese have been thinking about establishing a base at Walvis Bay in Namibia in the southern Atlantic. And what's even more concerning, and I mentioned this before, is Chinese officials have been looking at the Azores. The United States Air Force has a base, it's called Base Number 4, Lodges, and because of budget cutbacks has been reducing the presence there down to what they call a ghost base. then Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, I think it was in 2009, when he was going from Santiago, Chile, back to Beijing, actually didn't fly over the Pacific as you'd expect. He flew to lodges and spent a couple days on the island looking at not only the airbase, but also looking at the port facilities. And there have been clearly a lot of discussions between the Chinese and the Portuguese. So this is a concern because from lodges, which was a base that would control the mouth of the the Mediterranean, And also, it is closer to Washington, D.C. than Pearl Harbor is to Los Angeles. So it is important for us to make sure that it's sometimes difficult to tell the Air Force what to do, but it would seem that reducing our commitment to the Azores at a time when the Chinese want to use the Azores, it doesn't seem to be wise policy in the long term, because clearly we do not want Chinese planes flying over the Atlantic and threatening the American homeland.
Oh, thank you. Are you back?
Mr. Garrett?
Thank you. I want to touch on something that my colleague, Mr. Castro, spoke to. And and by the way, I am a listener to the John Batchelor program, so it's an honor to get to see you in person. And that is Chinese aid versus U.S. aid and the aid model. And I want you to tell me if I'm wrong, and I'll open this up to anybody, but I do have a finite amount of time. And that is that the Chinese have learned very quickly that it's easier to give a lot of money to a few people than it is to give even more to a large number of people. In other words, I was in an African nation that shall remain nameless for a particular reason, wherein the presidential palace was a wholly financed function of the Chinese government. It obviously endeared itself ultimately to 3 families. It was probably about the size of the Rayburn House office building. And by giving that aid, they didn't need to give aid to the people in that country who were living on less than $1 a day. Is that about right? The Chinese aid model is to pay off the oligarchs because they don't need to worry about the masses if they do that.
Some people have called it big project diplomacy. Build, for instance, as Dr. Plummer has talked about, the headquarters for the African Union. You built a soccer stadium. These are high-profile projects. The United States does something a little bit different. You know, we have a Peace Corps volunteer here, I guess. You know, the aid is more on a person-to-person level. You know, vaccines, which are important, clean water, these types of things which matter day-to-day, much more important than the headquarters for a multilateral organization in Addis Ababa. So I think that we're doing the right thing. It's just a question of whether we should be doing more. And let me just close out by saying that I'm privileged to know John Batchelor. So thank you very much.
Well, I have, as a new resident of the district, I have evolved into a great appreciation for the depth and subject matter expertise that's present in that venue. And I know I've digressed beyond the role of the committee today, but I do think I get analysis there I don't get other places. As it relates to sort of the neo-colonialist tag, which I candidly think is incredibly appropriate, it's been my observation in a very limited period of time and only a couple of different countries on the African continent that the reality is that China is on the ground in a depth that we as Americans and even as members of this body fail to understand as it relates to control of the apparatus that make things go, the infrastructure, if you will. The cliche that I've heard is that ultimately the infrastructure provided by the Chinese serves the Chinese at the expense of the local population, which looks an awful lot like colonialism to me. I would invite you to speak to the cliche that the roads that they build run from the resource to the port, and whether or not that's the reality, or if these projects and quote-unquote investments actually serve the local populaces. And I would speak to that for perspective, for example, to the story that was in Bloomberg 6 days ago with regard to the Chinese garment manufacturing endeavors in Ethiopia, and then the treatment of the workers therein, without even digressing into child labor circumstances in China, which they've told us have changed, but we have anecdotal and real evidence to indicate they haven't. So the infrastructure investment that the Chinese tout in the developing world, is that to serve the developing world, or is that to serve the Chinese, based on, and again, anybody chime in? Again, Mr. Chang, I hold you in extraordinarily high regard. I got 3 other awesome people here, including Dr. Plummer, who's got a Woodson Fellowship at UVA, which is in my district. So you're awesome. So anybody, the Chinese investment in infrastructure, is it serving these developing nations or is it serving China?
Well, I think it all depends on the project. So your first question, when you asked the scope of the infrastructure, who does it serve? You mentioned a prestige project, the presidential palace. You find that the Chinese government tends to be very responsive to what African elites request. So if there's an election year and an elite, a representative says, hey, I need a road built between these 2 towns, it's an election year, will you be able to deliver that project? Of course, it's not free. There's a loan taken out. leaders in China have been praised for being responsive in that way. So it's up to the African leadership to make certain requests. Let me
interrupt, not by disrespect, and not to even disagree. An autocratic regime is a lot more responsive, right, than a laboriously democratic.
Absolutely.
But go ahead.
Absolutely. So to answer your question, does the local population benefit from the infrastructure? It all depends on the quality of leadership and whether the leadership within that country works autonomously from their population or if they work to benefit their population. So it all depends. In terms of the large-scale transport infrastructure models and to some extent the power infrastructure models, geographers have gone in and mapped out where the roads, the railways, where the ports are being situated. And yes, you find that it's a two-way street. They benefit the extractive sectors, but also they're intended to get Chinese-made products into hard-to-get places within the African interior. So it serves that dual purpose. But you also find that some of the aid is within the agricultural sector, so to teach farmers how to build rice paddies. You have medical doctors that have been dispatched. You have teachers that have been dispatched to different areas. So it's a lot broader than just the large-scale infrastructure.
But I would say this, I mean, the racism manifests sort of, there's almost a Sino-supremacist sort of attitude amongst a segment of the Chinese leadership that they're just better than everybody else and that they're doing everybody a favor by virtue of gracing them with their presence, which I think harkens back to what we saw coming out of Europe for a couple of centuries. But that's troubling in a world where I think we should get back to the King model of content of character versus color of skin. And when it manifests itself in foreign policy, and I think China's not the only instance where this happens, but we aren't talking about some other regions right now that some of y'all might have some expertise in, that becomes worse. Let me ask you a rhetorical based on essentially my opinion, and let me give it to Joshua and Scott and conclude because y'all have been very indulgent. The U.S. model of international aid is the superior model if it is in a world wherein the individuals in receipt of the aid have self-determination. In other words, we give aid to the end user, the person who might lack a meal. I'm a huge champion of McGovern Dole, of educating women to reduce radicalism and create economic opportunity. Not because I like women better than men, but because we see patterns where educated women create greater opportunity, reduce radicalism, and lift the society, right? That if you take 50% of your population and disenfranchise them, that ultimately you never get to be as good as you can be. So when the end user is self-determinative and our aid goes to the end user, then our model works. But where there are autocratic regimes, where there are dictatorial regimes, the Chinese model works. Because essentially, you can call them priority projects or whatever you want to call them, but it's buying off the people at the top so as to extract benefit from essentially the sweat of the people at the bottom. Is that inaccurate in your opinion, Joshua or Mr. McSurvey? I'm dodging your last name because I don't want to mispronounce it. And Mr. Morris?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. In my written testimony, I called corruption a Chinese competitive advantage on the continent. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, as we've already talked about during this hearing, and you will go to prison if you're an American and you do the sorts of things that Chinese firms are frequently willing to do on the continent. And it's not just the Chinese, of course, but they are prime perpetrators. And I think the more fundamental issue is that governance is hugely important, as your question referenced, and fundamentally, the blame for striking a lot of irresponsible deals lies with governments in Africa, and they're to blame for signing these terrible contracts, for allowing themselves to be bought off in some situations. So I think our U.S. engagement, the aid model, should focus on improving governance on the continent, because also even poverty has very strong links to governance, and the MCC is a really positive model because it rewards good governance. So I think that's the direction in which U.S. policy should be going on these issues.
Mr. Morris.
So, Congressman, I would certainly agree with you completely on sort of core principles and values that are embodied in what we do internationally that look very different from China. That said, I would say that if you look at programs like PEPFAR, tremendous strides we've made through that program in incidents of disease, and frankly, irrespective of, in a lot of different kinds of countries. And I think it was really important not to be too restrictive about where we choose to try to make progress in an area like that. And then on the question of infrastructure, I think it is just, it is a fundamental driver of growth in economies today. And again, that's irrespective of political models. I think you're right, though, that at the end of the day, the political models bear directly on how that goes when you do actually engage. But I do think, with our model of leading on global health issues, on humanitarian issues, disaster response, it's critical that we're there when there's a need and find ways to work even when governance is challenged. It's amazing, and I say this as an aside, and I thank the chair for his indulgence, but to ask the opinion of George W. Bush in Africa versus in America, right? Because we did stuff that helped human beings, and they get it. So, without advocating on behalf of a particular administration, when you help people, you help America, and when you empower people and create hope, then we reduce radicalization, and as McMaster said, we buy fewer bombs. Having said that, I serve in the military. I want to have a strong military. I don't want to have to use it. We should never aspire to use it. Thank you guys immensely.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Just to conclude, I do have one final question. In my own home state of New Jersey, our former U.S. Attorney, Christopher Christie, was able, when he looked at corruption within our own state, put about 130 politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, behind bars over an 8-year period as he served as U.S. Attorney. As a matter of fact, there was a book written called The Soprano State that really showed that corruption is in so many places. So when we talk about it overseas, we need to look in the mirror. It's here as well. But you, Mr. Chang, talked about some of the dealings between Beijing and African states being tainted by corruption. I chair the Helsinki Commission, co-chair it. In 2000, I should say, there was a big conference. We have one every year. It's an annual conference in Bucharest. The theme of it was that corruption is the hijacker of democracies. And it seems to me that when there's no Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to hold the bad players to account, and bags of money are showing up, it has a coercive and I think a totally debilitating impact on democracy, which we want every African country, every country in the world, to enjoy the benefits of a robust democracy. If any of you would like, as we conclude, to speak to that issue, and I remember in Bucharest, we were talking to a lot of the emerging democracies, and some of whom were going the wrong way, sadly, Russia being probably chief among them. And of course, the kleptocracy there, and the oligarchs have stolen so much, robbed the people of so much there, and Putin is right walking point on that. So if you could speak to that issue, because I think on the intermediate, long term, short term as well, we want Africa to thrive. Can't thrive when you got corruption.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, what I thought was really striking was that in the era of Hu Jintao, the predecessor to Xi Jinping, his son was implicated in a bribery scandal in Tanzania for the sale of airport scanners, I believe that it was. And this indicates that this is not just some Chinese businessman being caught trying to bribe an African official. This goes to the top. This went to the top of the Chinese political system. And I think people understood that this was the nature of China in Africa, in other places as well. And so you see this replicated, as Dr. Plummer said, you got to look at it country by country. But nonetheless, this was one very glaring example of the son of a Chinese political leader bribing officials in Africa and being withdrawn out of Africa to avoid embarrassment in Beijing.
Dr. Plummer.
Chairman Smith, thank you so much for bringing up the corruption issue. I just want to reiterate the illicit financial flows. Billions of dollars are leaving Africa every year, and they're being held in banks in Europe, in the United States, and in the Caribbean. And the United States can play a role in helping to recover that money and repatriate it back to the continent. So I think that's something that's very tangible, that we can play a role because we have robust institutions to be able to investigate where this money is going and where it's being held.
Mr. Morris, what role should we play?
I just want to agree with Dr. Plummer. I think this is, I mean, it's not what we consider by any means traditional foreign aid, but it's a critical function of the U.S. government that, you know, we're providing a good to the global community in this regard by acting aggressively in this area.
I'll give a quick example to supplement what Dr. Plummer said. The Vice President of Equatorial Guinea is the son of the president there, actually. And he has had luxury vehicles and mansions seized all over the world now because, in Europe and in the US, because those governments decided to go after him. There's a plethora of opportunities to do that sort of thing. The US has particular leverage with dual citizens who populate governments in Somalia and South Sudan. So that's an obvious another area. And it's not just China that engages in this activity. Gulf states are very bad in this way as well.
Thank you so very much for sharing your insights and wisdom with the subcommittee. The hearing is adjourned.